Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another episode of Books and Looks, brought to you by Podcast Studio X. Hello, friends. It's another week, another book, another author interview, and I'll tell you what, I welcome all of you and thank you for your continued support. And I'm telling you what, I'm seeing a lot of you coming on, not just listen to the podcast, you're following us also on the YouTube channel and viewsonbooks.com. I'm telling you, what a spike in people who are reading the reviews. It's great. I thank you so much. I'm just a poor little independent guy. And yet my reviews and numbers are out of this world. So thanks so much. I really appreciate it. You know, today we've got a real fun book for you. It's we're going to Paris, as a matter of fact. That's right. We're going to Gay Paris, to a book called A Bakery in Paris. The author's name is Aimie Runyan. Aimie talks to us about her experiences. She was a French major in college and ended up studying in France and becoming a lover of all things French. And so many of her books are placed there. She's another one of these prolific writers. I mean, it's out of this world. The number of books she's writing now, has written, in the process of writing. It's very something, because she tells us she never started writing until she was 33 years old. That's amazing. So she's telling us about this book, which is interesting because it takes place at the end of the Franco-Russian Wars in the 1870s, and then she jumps to the end of World War II. That's right. She has two different timelines, two different narrators and characters. One, Lisette, in the 1870s, is the great-grandmother of Michelin, who's in the end of World War II. And we see their similarities and their stories. We see the differences. We see them all focusing around a little bakery up in Montmartre region of Paris. And she tells us a lot about baking. Oh, my. Amy's a prolific baker. She loves it. She tells us some of her favorite French foods and pastries that she has. This book contains also recipes. That's right. French recipes are in this book. There's a lot going on here. And again, I learned a lot about the Franco-Russian War that I was unaware of through this book. And great thanks to her for this, because it's one of those things, we can't learn all things about all history, but when you get it in a book, wow, that really brings it all home. So this is a fun interview we're going to have. Her name is Aimie Runyan. So without any further ado, let's go right into that interview. Aimie, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Glad you could join us. I hear you're coming to us from the Rocky Mountain State.
Yes, I am in Estes Park, Colorado. Beautiful, beautiful place.
That's wonderful. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where'd you come from in terms of your history of writing, and did you take classes, and how did you get into the whole writing profession?
I'm originally from Northern California, and I was significantly younger than my older sisters. And so that kind of necessitates a lot of time alone, as you can imagine. So I just became obsessed with reading at a very young age. And I had wonderful teachers growing up, and they noticed my proclivity toward writing, and they always encouraged it. And I remember distinctly in third grade, we had the first opportunity to write a short story, and we went through the whole editorial process from rough draft through finished product, and we were to copy down our finished product in these very professional books that were bound by one of the grandmothers in class, and mine was leopard print. Thought it was the coolest thing ever. And then you illustrated the whole thing. And I just thought that it was a powerful thing to be able to write your own stories. And, it was my first experience in self-publishing. I thought it was fabulous. And they cast me as Scribbler Mouse in the play that year. And the die was basically cast. And I was constantly writing really bad poetry, short stories, and what have you. I started writing a novel when I was in high school. I probably have a bad draft of it around here somewhere. But I never thought it was a viable way to make a living. Everybody said, oh, you're so good at it, but, it's too hard to earn a living as an author. So I decided to major in something more practical, which was French. And I'm not sure why I thought that was more practical, but every dime I've ever made is at least tangentially responsible because of my French major. So I'm very grateful I did that. And it led to me studying abroad, but the writing bug never left. And when I turned 33, I was working from home before it was cool. I was a French teacher for an online school, and I had 2 very small children. And I managed to claim an hour or 2 every afternoon to read a book while the babies were napping and my work was done before I had to go cook dinner. And so one day I read a book and it was so terrible. I'm like, you know what? I need to pick up this book that I'd started writing back in graduate school, and I should give it a shot. Why not me? So I pulled it out, and instead of reading a book every afternoon, I'd spend an hour or 2 writing it. And 6 months later, I had a really bad draft of a book, and I worked to make it better. And then I attended some writing conferences and got a mentor, and not long after got an agent, and the rest is really history. Yeah, I've been very fortunate that I don't have a lot of trunk novels, lots of trunk ideas, but no trunk novels. And I've just been absolutely fortunate. I only took 2 creative writing classes in my entire academic career. They were definitely useful, but especially for growing a thick skin when you have to sit around, you're not allowed to speak, and you have like 20 other people critiquing your work and you have to just take it. I don't think an MFA is absolutely necessary for this job, but it's certainly nice to have, and I'm an adjunct for Drexel University in their MFA program, and I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful program to teach you how to be a professional author. Not a writing instructor, but a professional author, which is great.
It's amazing. I have been interviewing numerous authors who, by the time they get 30, they finally realize it's time for them to start writing. And last week, we had an author named Heather B. Moore on who wrote a wonderful book called Under the Java Moon, and she began at age 30. So I find it interesting that around age 33, you started also getting that itch to say, I can do better than what I'm reading. And you have been, as she is, extremely prolific. But you began, you said, as a short story writer. Did you publish any short stories?
Well, you know, I dabbled in short story writing, and I did have one that was published in kind of a charity anthology. All the proceeds go to the Women in Engineering Fund. And believe it or not, it was sci-fi. And it was something that I was asked to do by a friend. And oh gosh, it was fun. I enjoy watching Star Wars and Star Trek. I enjoy the genre from a visual perspective, but it's not something I often read, and certainly nothing I've ever considered writing. But they asked if I'd contribute a female-centric sci-fi short story. And, you know, it was a nice little contribution to that anthology, and I thought it was fun. But I haven't written a lot of short stories. I found it really hard to contain the ideas. It ends up feeling like the first chapter of a novel rather than a proper short story.
Right. That's a real technique to be able to give you a beginning, middle, and end in 20 pages. But then you switched over to novel writing. Now, one of your first novels was called Promised to the Crown, if I'm not mistaken. What was that all about?
Well, actually, that was born of my master's degree research. I had the amazing opportunity. The topic of my master's thesis was female immigration from France to Canada in the late 1600s. And they had a program for women. They would pay their expenses to go over from France to Canada, which, as you can imagine, was very expensive in the late 1600s. And they gave them a small trousseau and, in some cases, a dowry to marry one of the settlers over there, because they wanted these men to have families and attach themselves to the land and become farmers so that they would be more willing to defend the land from British invasion. And so I had the chance to live in Canada for a few months and do research. I won a grant from the Canadian government to do my research there. And I wanted to write a novel the whole time. And so I just squirreled away research that I could use for that novel while I was working on my thesis. And so it's a story of 3 women who embark on that journey from France to Canada in order to be part of the founding of New France, which would become Quebec today.
You did another book on this Daughters of the New France series, but then you stopped. Now, did the stories end, or are you going to go back to that at all at some time?
I'd love to. The reality is I kind of envisioned it being 4 stories, and it would end with pretty much the end of the French reign in Canada, which was with the Battle on the Plains of Abraham, which would have been about 100 years after the beginning of the series. But the reality is the market wasn't very warm to the idea in the beginning. And, you know, it's very interesting. Books have a long shelf life. And Promise to the Crown and its sequel, Duty to the Crown, they didn't do well at first. And so I ended up switching gears and I started writing World War II fiction, because that was when it was really taking off. And I wrote Daughters of the Night Sky, which is about the Russian female fighter pilots in World War II. I went to a new publishing house, and Kensington, my first publisher, was very, very smart. And we intimated to them that Daughters of the Night Sky was going to be a lead title and it was going to get a lot of attention. It might be a good time to get a price drop for Promise to the Crown. And they managed to secure a BookBub ad with really good timing, and it sold over 4,500 copies in one day. And it has been selling really nicely ever since. And both of those books earned out when that was kind of a lost cause. And so it's amazing that those things can help resurrect a book series that had not done well. And now they have like over 1,000 reviews each on Amazon, which is a good metric for how things are selling. And it felt really good. I remember when the second book in the series earned out, I bought myself like an Apple Watch or something to commemorate, because I'd kind of given up on those books. But it goes to show that sales really are weird in this business, and they can happen years after the fact.
Well, see, that's one of the things that I like to do, and I'm hoping that my friends who listen do too. Because we're going to talk about a bakery in Paris, but I think when you read this book, everybody, you're going to go back and read her other works. And that's what I like to do. I like to see the author's progression. Where are they coming from? How are they moving? What are they doing? And this is perfect. And I think that's great to go back and see these books. And Kensington was very smart. And because you're a darn good writer, that's the reason.
Oh, thank you. Like I say, they're a great ex-publisher. They've really kept those books alive, and not all publishers would do that. They've rebranded the ebook covers a couple times. The new cover for Promise to the Crown in particular is so good. Oh my gosh, the font treatment, no notes. It's beautiful.
Wow, great. Well, I guess we're going to talk about your current book. That's called A Bakery in Paris. Now, what was the inspiration for the book, and what then draws you to a certain locale and time period?
It was after I was finished with Across the Winding River, and I was playing with various ideas. I was kind of at another crossroads, like, do I want to stay with this publisher? Do I want to branch out? Do I want to stay in the world wars? Because, that bubble was going to burst. And I do feel like that bubble is kind of bursting a little bit. We're switching away. I was dating a historian at the time, and I was kicking around. He's like, well, you've got a master's in French. Why don't you write about the Paris Commune? I'm like, you know what, Jeremy, that's a great idea. That's really, really smart. And I started researching it. I thought, well, I could pair it with a post-war narrative and kind of do a compare and contrast, because it really is showing Paris in two similar but different time periods, when Paris is really in a period of revolution and rebuilding and healing. And I thought that it would be a great way to kind of bring my World War II readership along with me, but move on. And it was a transition away from World War II. And I ended up doing the School for German Brides first. For, long story short, that was the one that got picked up. As soon as that was turned in, I had the proposal with sample chapters ready to go. And my lovely editor, Tessa Woodward at William Morris, snapped it right up. And as a spoiler, I ended up marrying that historian, and we got the news of the book deal during our honeymoon.
Wow. Super. That's super. Well, you use in this book two different timelines, two different stories, two different narrators. How about telling us a little bit about who these ladies are and how are they interconnected?
Okay, so our first heroine is Lisette, and she is in the 1870/1871 timeline. She comes from a very wealthy family in one of the most prestigious parts of Paris, which is the Place des Vosges. And at the point in time when we started, it's called the Place Royale, because we had the monarchy rising and falling several different times. It would swap between being the Place Royale and the Place des Vosges, depending on whether or not the monarchy was in charge. And to give you an idea of how prestigious this little area of Paris is, Victor Hugo's house is there, and you can visit it today. Beautiful, beautiful place. But for poor Lisette, it's a bit of a prison, because she's not allowed to leave. She can't go any further than the courtyard inside the Place des Vosges. And it's taking place during the siege of Paris. It's the Franco-Russian War. And the Prussians have what we would call modern-day Germans, had managed to circle off. We have to remember Paris is a walled city. And they have Paris basically encircled and trying to starve out the town. And so basically it's the precursor to World War I. And a lot of the groundwork for that was laid here. And she escapes one day to help do some marketing, and she goes out and she meets a National Guardsman, which were pretty rebellious folks at the time. They'd just about had it with the government, and how they botched the war and how they were not taking care of the people. And she has her ideals shattered. The way she'd been raised, her entire worldview is shattered after a few encounters with this National Guardsman, as she decides to forgo her life of privilege in order to live a life that will allow her to look at herself in the mirror, really. And the other timeline is 1946, and we have Michelin, Lisette's great-granddaughter. Her father died early in World War II, and her mother went missing late in World War II. She's 19 years old and has been left with the raising of her younger sisters, who are age 8 and 12. And things go from bad to worse because their income is reliant on renting out this bakery. There was a space below the flat where they lived, and Lisette uses it as a bakery to help feed the neighborhood. We talk about food deserts. That was definitely a problem in Paris in the 1870s. By Michelin's time, they'd rented it out for use as a bistro, and that was their income. And she supplemented with things like mending and what have you. When the tenants of the bistro up and leave, she's left without a lot of recourse. And so she has a kindly neighbor that suggests she reopens it as a bakery. And she basically funds her education to send her to baking school. And she has to decide if this is really the path forward she wants. And it's all about her finding her agency, whereas Lisette's timeline is really about her choosing what to do with the tremendous amount of agency she actually has.
Mm-hmm. They're very well done, very well interconnected. What's nice is while they're far apart, they're not too far apart. And like I said, great-granddaughter and great-grandmother, again, a few generations, but there's interesting ties and similarities. Now, is it difficult to write a book with these two separate timelines and stories and narrators?
I've done multiple timelines before, and they all have their own difficulties. I've done multiple POVs in different timelines, and when I was writing Across the Winding River, I found that I'd lose momentum as soon as I switched from one POV character to the other. So I would write ahead. Like I'd write a few Max chapters, then a few Johanna chapters, and a few Beth chapters. Not getting too far ahead, but not losing momentum. And so what I decided to do with this one was write all of Lisette's story first. And it went beautifully, but I was at 50,000 words. And for those of you not in the know, most of us in the mid-list, they like us to keep our books at about 100,000 words. And originally, there was going to be a third timeline set in the 1990s with Michelin's great-granddaughter coming to reopen the bakery as well. But then I wrote Michelin's timeline, and it was great fun. It was a lot of drama, a lot of angst, very high stakes. So Michelin's timeline was also very easy to write, and I was at 80,000 words by the time that was over. So I'm like, gosh, I don't have a lot of time left for poor Veronica. And I started writing her first chapter. I think I spent a week rewriting and rewriting her first chapter, and it just wasn't coming. And so I ended up firing up an email to Dear Tessa, and I said, listen, this third timeline isn't working. How would you feel about me just expanding Michelin's timeline and tying them together? And she said, if that's what the muse is telling you to do, go for it. And I felt, honored that she trusted me to that degree. And so what I did was I expanded Michelin's timeline a bit, which was very easy to do. And then I wrapped them together, and I was always going to have a few of the recipes, but then I decided to add in some more. And I put in a dozen of the recipes and used them as kind of a vehicle for tying the two timelines together.
Is it difficult to write this? And do you then write one and then write the other one? Because I have spoken to some people who don't. They go boom, 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 boom that way. But it seems like you like to write the one story pretty much, then go to the next story.
I have to admit, I was worried because I'd never done it this way. And I was worried about how the ebb and flow would work, because it's kind of like a good playlist of music. You have to have the rise and fall. And they have to work together. But honestly, the arcs work together pretty seamlessly. I didn't feel like I had to shoehorn very much at all. And we didn't move a lot of things around in edits. Edits were actually pretty modest on this book. I was actually quite thrilled. But, it's one of those books that every book has its own challenges. But this one, I think, from a writing perspective, flowed very easily. It was one of those ones that you're grateful to have.
Did you see the characters moving you in a different direction? Did their stories move you and what you expected and what you ended up with being something a little bit different? I think that this book was very close to what I envisioned.
Other books have given me more surprises, like in The School for German Brides, there was a secondary character who should have probably even had her own POV. She became so good. But this one, Pierrine, the character from the 1870s who becomes an unlikely friend, she's sort of the Eponine character. She became more important than I envisioned, and I really liked her. I was really pleased. The relationship between the kind of new little family in the second one, between Micheline and Laurent and the two sisters, forging this weird family dynamic, that was a fun discovery that I hadn't planned on. And I really liked how those characters, they worked through their difficulties to become a family. And I liked that a lot.
Well, before we go any further, we got to talk about these recipes. Now, we love these recipes from the book. And the fact you write the recipes from the 1870s Lisette's recipes, and they don't have anything about weights, measurements, times of cooking. They're just this, and this. And is that how a lot of them were back then? And did you use any for references?
So yeah, a lot of the recipes were like a pound of this. And of course, a lot of the recipes were designed for use in a bakery. So I wouldn't recommend that anybody try the recipes from the book at home necessarily, but they were modeled after original carême recipes. And yes, they used actually like the English measurements like pounds and ounces instead of the metric. I actually had a reviewer say, hey, now the Système International had been used for quite some time, like 20 years by the time this time period would have come around. Like, well, carême wasn't using it. So those were the model. I based all the recipes off carême, or most of them. A few of them were my own flights of fancy, like the rose petal jam. I condensed them, made them more readable, and I used them sort of like a journal, like a professional chef would do with notes, like next time let's try this, or next time, we'll experiment with these flavors, and I had a great deal of fun with that. Now, if you actually want to learn how to make some of these recipes, I'm doing a series on my social media with a new recipe every Tuesday. This week was tarte au citron, or lemon curd pie. And I do a little teaser video and then I link everybody over to my blog so that you can get step-by-step instructions on how to make these recipes. There are recipes from the book as well as my own flights of fancy.
Wonderful, wonderful. This use of the recipes by Micheline, this is important because she's trying to learn how to cook, but she's having an issue with Chef Rossignol. How does that help her out?
Well, the truth is that Chef Rossignol is a wise man, and he understands, he can see from the way she's struggling that her heart isn't necessarily in the baking. She is not decided. You can't bake half-heartedly. Baking is very precise, and that's why a lot of people find it soothing, because at the end of the day, if you follow the rules, it should turn out. Certain recipes like, macaron, those are like 3/4 witchcraft and 1/4 science. But most of the time, if you mix butter and eggs and sugar with chocolate, it's going to get thick and you're going to end up with a cake. And that's really reassuring. But if you're half-hearted about it, things don't turn out. And that's her problem, is that she hasn't decided that that's the path she wants to take in life. And that's really the whole point to her story, is that she has to commit. Is this the path you really want or not? And that, she feels like she has no choice, but in reality, it's the only choice she has to make is what, yes or no. Is this your path forward or not?
It was a big task because she had the bakery underneath her. What is she going to do? How is she going to do it? Will people really want to come? And one of the things that kept coming to my mind was, I know the war was just about over or had just ended. Did they really have all these supplies and the ingredients they needed for something like this?
The rationing was easing, so they would have had access. I think the baking schools would have been slowly opening back up. I know that by 1947, Julia Child was back at the Cordon Bleu. So I think that those things were slowly opening back up. If it's a year too soon, I apologize to my most dedicated fact checkers. But I think that definitely things were coming back. They were getting more access. And I think that the United States certainly shipped over supplies to help out, to ease the rationing. Things were getting better. It all has to do with the rebuilding. And I think that, I think Micheline, she mentions like, it's great to actually see a few things on the shelves. It's not the way it used to be, but they actually have flour on the shelves now. They have sugar. It may not be in the quantities they used to, but it's slowly coming back to pre-war levels.
Well, now we have Micheline and her learning to cook. And then you've got Lisette, who didn't learn to cook in a traditional way, I don't think. It was about, what's the character's name, Nanette? Is that, am I thinking?
Nanette? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's almost her mentor, if I'm not mistaken. Who is Nanette?
Nanette is the chef for the family. And so I think Lisette, in some sense, learned in the most traditional way possible at the elbow of her mother, for lack of another term, because Nanette really did raise Lisette because her parents were too busy, doing their own thing. Nanette spent more time with Lisette growing up than any other human being. And Lisette was forever sneaking off to the kitchens where a proper young lady had no business other than to give orders for dinner or to pass off a list for the marketing. And she was obsessed with learning how the kitchen worked, even though it was something that should have been below her notice. And it was just part of her soul, part of her passion. And it's, direct contrast to Michelin, who always enjoyed watching her mother cook, but it wasn't necessarily something she ever envisioned for herself until it became her reality.
Did Michelin's mother operate the bistro below the building?
No, they rented it out because she didn't really want to cook to that degree. And her father had a good job in a factory. And so he wanted her to stay at home and be a traditional stay-at-home wife. And she was happy with that. But her mother, I envision, really helping out in the neighborhood. If somebody had something urgent to do, she would mind their children. If somebody needed mending done, she helped them out. Sending over a dish for a new mother. She basically was kind of like a mother hen to the neighborhood, because she had the leisure to be able to do that.
One of the things that's interesting is you bring in the fact that Michelin has lost her mother, and the family is suffering from that. All of them, all three kids. But this was pretty common during World War II. A lot of people lost relatives and couldn't find them, but they weren't on the official death list. So how were you able to research that?
What I did was I did a lot of research about how people would scour for their loved ones and what the process was through the Red Cross to help find missing people. But by this point, a full year after she was first reported missing, the chances of recovering her alive were next to nothing. And identifying, because millions of people died in the war on all the fronts and everything, identifying everybody who went missing would have been almost an impossible task. And so that was where a lot of the research came in. And they weren't based on real women per se. They were fictionalized versions of a lot of different stories that happened during the war.
It was a very difficult time because, like you said, millions were killed. You had no idea who's alive, who's dead, who's in a POW camp, who's in a hospital, who's just disappeared, And it's a very difficult time period for the survivors there in this case in Paris, but for all over Europe. Well, now, one of the things that was interesting was that, and I couldn't quite be sure, she kept going to, I guess it would be like the mayor of her area to find out information. Was he being unhelpful, or was he being kind and being unhelpful? What do you think?
Well, I think that he was beleaguered. There were a lot of people like Michelin who were looking for missing loved ones, and there was so little he could do. I think he felt helpless, and I think that, he's a good representative of men, the survival guilt. And, I think that was a big theme of that timeline, was the difficulty for the survivors. Because so many World War II books, you've got the plucky young heroine, she's probably a spy, probably French, she comes in, saves the day, the Nazis go home, and we all live happily ever after. But there was definitely a hard rebuilding period. It was very challenging. She was definitely an example of people who had to survive through hard times, only to find that it wasn't all that rosy after the war. And the men in particular felt very emasculated by what they endured during the war. And that's why there was a lot of reprisals against the women who collaborated with the Germans to survive.
Yeah, that's it, to survive. That's the whole key. What do you do to survive? You can't have everybody being a part of the resistance. Now, and we hadn't discussed this, but you brought this up that, you got in the beginning of the World War II fictional novel thing, and now you're starting to see a decrease in that. What do we see it shifting towards?
Everything has its moment. Before the World War II thing, it was the Tudors for ages and ages. With the advent of the Tudor show on HBO, and Philippa Gregory was in her heyday with the other Boleyn girl. And oh man, I ate up those books. I loved the Tudor phase. And I started writing right as that was edging out, and we didn't know what the next big thing was going to be. And thankfully, my editor at Kensington said, oh, maybe it's Canadian colonials. We'll give it a shot. And newsflash, it wasn't Canadian colonials, but that is what it is. World War II will always have a readership. There will always be room in the market for people like Pam Jenoff. That's her career. She writes love songs to Jewish Europe during World War II. That's what she does. She will always have a readership. It's kind of an evergreen topic. But I think more and more it's going to be the big names, and it's going to be unique twists, kind of like The School for German Brides was territory that hadn't been done. Everything has its moment. Now, what's coming next? That is $1 million question. If you had the answer to that, you would be a very wealthy man, or at least a highly published author, because we don't know what's coming next. It means that it's kind of an exciting period. It's sort of the Wild Wild West moment, but I think that we'll find in the next year or so what the next trend will be for the next few years. But of course, my caution to that is for any writers listening on, that by the time you jump on the bandwagon, we're going to be moving on to the next big thing. But, World War II had a long moment.
World War I had a moment too.
Yeah, it was kind of in tandem.
Right. That 100-year anniversary spawned a ton of books about that. But what I'm finding in World War II books, and again, I don't mean to disparage anybody, but it's all about Auschwitz, Dachau. It's the same thing, just another person's little bit of twist. That's what makes your book different. And you don't get into that stuff. You get into something completely different, the end of the war, not what people suffered during the war. And that's why I think I like this book. And I think people who read this book will find it refreshing in its scope.
I will leave the mainstream sort of books that everybody's reading. Yeah, we had The Nightingale. That was really the first book. That and The Light We Cannot See really set off the whole trend. Beautiful books, highly recommend, by the way. But I figured that territory had been done. And so I tried to find kind of niche topics that would feed into that readership. Because I figure if territory's already been done, why do it over again?
I agree 100%. When I go on to NetGalley and get books and get recommendations from PR firms and people, I'm seeing the same basic story again and again and again, and it's like, it sounds good, but I've done that. I've read that. I want to see something completely different. And that's why I enjoyed your book so much. And then the one I did last week, which was set in a POW camp over in Java during World War II. So you don't hear that covered too much either. By the way, let's go back to cooking a minute. Do you have a favorite French food you like to cook?
I do love the tarte au citron is probably one of my favorite non-chocolate desserts. And so making lemon curd is definitely something I enjoy a lot. And as far as like savory recipes, a good coq au vin, which is chicken and red wine sauce, is lovely. And just let it simmer all day long until it's like falling apart. It's delightful. And French onion soup. Oh, French onion soup is one of my ideal comfort foods with a side of French fries. Oh, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Wow. Well, now tell me, where are we going? Where's Aimie Runyan going next? Are you going to stay in France? You're going to go to another location? What's on the writing horizon for you, Aimie?
I have a lot on the writing horizon. I am a very fortunate woman, but I am branching into I'm doing both a historical line and moving into contemporary women's fiction. And for the foreseeable future, everything is in France, at least in part. My debut women's fiction is called The Memory of Lavender and Sage, and it takes place in Provence. And it's about a woman who basically has never felt like part of her family. She gets a modest inheritance after the death of her father, and she decides to go visit the village where her mother was born and raised. Her mother had died many years before the start of the story. And she learns a lot about her family history. And I don't want to give too much away, but it really was a delightful book. And it takes place in Provence. If A Bakery in Paris is my love letter to Paris, this is my love letter to Provence. So that comes out February 13th, and it's on NetGalley. And the cover is spectacular. So thank you very much to Harper Muse for that. But then in September of next year, my next historical is called Mademoiselle Eiffel. And it's the story of Claire Eiffel, the daughter of the famous architect Gustave Eiffel, who built the tower. She took over as her father's assistant and running his household at the age of 14 when her mother died very young from a lung complications of pneumonia, I believe. And she ended up leading a really remarkable life as her father's assistant, and she lived the rest of her life with her father. Even though she got married, they lived with him in his house, and she helped run the business. She helped run the household, and she really was a remarkable woman and had a great deal of fun researching her story. I got access to the Eiffel family archives at the Musée d'Orsay, and so I'm really looking forward to seeing how that one's received. And then after that, I've got another contemporary women's fiction under contract and some other ideas up in the air for 2025. So we'll see where everything goes from there.
Holy moly. Do you write 24 hours a day?
No, but I do write 7 days a week. Even if it's only for an hour, I try to get in words every single day, and it amasses very quickly.
Wow. I spoke with one author who told me that there are certain times of year that they don't find themselves very productive. Partly where they live, it's extremely hot and it gets extremely cold. Do you have any times of year or days or times of day that are better for you to write?
I am an early morning writer most of the time, though sometimes I can get a second wind in the afternoon. But I am definitely somebody who prefers cold weather to write. I find summer is my least productive time, but there's a lot of reasons for that. My kids are home from school. It's hiking season here in Estes Park. We use some of that kind of prime time because you have to hike first thing in the morning to avoid the afternoon thunderstorms. So I use kind of my prime time for hiking to stay in shape because I found that staying active physically helps my mental frame and helps my productivity immensely. But I do love writing, and fall and winter are my ideal times to write first thing in the morning when it's cold, bundled under a blanket in my recliner with the laptop,
Wow. Hopefully you have coffee. I mean, all you ladies I speak with, and it's all the ladies I've been talking with lately in my fall season, you all start at 5, 6, 7. How do you do that? I need coffee. I need to get started. How do you get right into doing it? My brain isn't working at that time of day.
Yeah, there's definitely coffee involved. I could start writing at 5 a.m., but getting up when it's dark is hard. But I usually love to hit the ground running as soon as my kids are on the bus at 7 a.m.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, that's a good time of that to write is when the kids are on the bus. Yep. And you have a free time to yourself. Well, that's wonderful. I'll tell you. Well, Aimie, you have been a joy to talk with. I've loved this. I love the book, A Bakery in Paris. It is a wonderful book. It's not your traditional World War II story. It's a different story. We do timelines, 2 different people. It's wonderful. And I thank you so much for writing it, but also for coming on today and talking about it. Glad to have you on today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate you.
All right. Friends, we'll be back in just a moment. Well, friends, I hope you enjoyed that interview as much as I did. I had a great time talking with Aimie, and who came from us out there in Estes Park, Colorado. And I'm so happy we could have her on and discuss her book, A Bakery in Paris. Really, really fun book. And I'm going to tell you what, the recipes are great. Have already tried some. They are very good. That's all I can say. So, yeah, you might want to get this book because I think it's one you want to have in your library, maybe even your cooking library. I'm not sure. Anyway, what have I been looking at this week? Well, I'll tell you what. I've been looking at, classics and a TV show. People are concerned about the writer's strike. It doesn't really do much for me. I don't really watch a lot of contemporary TV shows. I watch a lot of stuff on Netflix. And so I just wanted to have a nice show. And one of the shows that popped up, I want to recommend to you, is called Anne with an E. Anne with an E, which is the story of Anne of Green Gables. Well, it's not completely her story. Of course, they had to embellish things and do some stuff, but much of it follows that book. It's a nice story. It's a wonderful story. I have such appreciation now for the writer, Lucy Maud Montgomery, that I have gone out and I've purchased all her books. That's right. I purchased all her novels. I was able to go onto Kindle. I don't know if I should be able to say this, but why not? I went onto Kindle and I bought all 18 of her novels for $1.90. Are you kidding me? 10 cents a novel? And it's so great to read what Lucy Maud Montgomery wrote back in the early 1900s and see it translated onto film. It is just wonderful, and how much the similarities are. It's as if they almost didn't have to do a screenplay. Just read the beginning of the book. It's just that good and that close, and the characters are vibrant. They're vibrant in the book. They're vibrant in the TV show. There are some wonderful actors. It's all about growing up on Prince Edward Island. in the early 1900s, and Anne of Green Gables is an orphan who's placed with a family that actually wants a boy and ends up getting a girl. That was a that was a problem, and she almost got sent back to the orphanage. But luckily for Anne, that didn't happen. But anyway, it's something which you're going to watch. Sometimes people say, well, I want to watch a little something before I go to bed, or I want to watch something less violent. Anne with an E is one of those shows. It's a very good show. It's a fun show. And like I said, the books are outstanding. If you're like me and you like to read on Kindle because the fonts are a little bit bigger and everything else, you can get it for, like I said, $1.90 for all 18 novels. I think there's 6 of the Anne of Green Gables series, and it follows her after just that. So there's a lot going on here. So this is what I want to recommend to you. This is what I've been looking at. Yeah, I know. I read books for the show, but I have other things I want to read too. And Anne of Green Gables is one that, growing up as a kid, you say, it sounds a little girly. You know what? The story's great. And I wish I would have read it a lot earlier in my life. I think you're going to really enjoy it. Anyway, that's all for this week. So on behalf of viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book.